Richard.
Hi. All right. Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see some familiar faces online, colleagues and former students as well. And I'm really pleased to be here with you this evening to talk about something I'm very excited about, which is a topic that I've been recently writing a book on with my colleague and very good friend, Danny Norrington Davies. And we'd like to share with you this evening some of the things that we've been looking at. So we're looking at the topic of, can everyone see my screen? Can you give me a quick, someone give me a shout because I can't see you. Can you see me? Brilliant, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, all right, and there will be a bit of audience participation because I'm not a fan of a lecture, being a teacher trainer and all that. So this is my colleague Danny Norrington Davies, and this talk follows on from a talk that he did pre-pandemic face-to-face at Teaching House in Oxford Street, just off Oxford Street. And he looked at classroom interaction, what teachers do when they intervene when learners need help. This evening, we're going to look at teacher development and what we can do to better respond to our learners in terms of content, and then look at what we might do in terms of working with the language that comes up. So just to start with, I'd like to share with you a little vignette that happened in class. This is about last year sometime. I was observing on a Delta course, and I'll just let Yumiko in. I was observing on a Delta course, and at the beginning of the lesson, the teacher was having a lovely chat with the students who were pre-intermediate, and the teacher asked the students at the beginning of the lesson, she asked them, what did they do that morning? Because the class was in the afternoon. And the student said, I water the flowers. It makes you think all morning? Well, at least he said something. So he responded to what the teacher had asked. And then the teacher asked a follow-up question. She said, you have a garden. That was a really nice, genuine question here, trying to get the student to say some more. And the student responded with, no garden, and was stuck and was getting quite frustrated with not knowing the concrete noun he needed to get his meaning across. Following this, one of the other students jumped in to try and help the student. Balcony. The teacher picked up on this and reformulated this and said, do you have a balcony? And the student, still confused, said, no balcony, just what do you think he was trying to say? Any ideas?
Like a window box.
Basically, window box, right? Okay, now it does make you think. A few things here. First of all, we wouldn't ever go out of our way to teach the word window box because it's very low surrender value. It's not that frequent. You'd never come across it in a course book. But in that moment, the student needed that piece of language in order to say what they wanted to say. And also, it does make you think. What was the student? How big is this window box? Were they spending all morning on it? So. In this little interaction, we look at, this is quite a natural thing that happens in all classrooms. And the point I'd like to make to begin this session is that emergent language isn't something esoteric or odd. It's not an add-on. It's a natural part of the process of classroom interaction when we're helping scaffold and support our learners in what they want to be able to say. There's often a distinction made between emergent language and target language. Target language is obviously the language that we plan to teach that day, but emergent language can sit quite happily alongside the language that you are teaching that day, given that you give enough space for meaningful interaction to happen. Okay, so what is emergent language? Well, I want to share with you the definition that Danny and I have been using so far. And we're looking at it being unplanned language that happens in a lesson that's needed by the learners in meaning-focused interactions. And then the language can be explored, reformulated and clarified by the teacher. And this is the kind of support that the teacher gives in class. So, as I say, this is a normal part of the learning process. Anyone who's ever learned a language will have experienced these episodes. These things happen naturally in class, but there's very little written about how we should actually deal with this in class and what we can do to deal with it effectively when we're working with our learners. So the key conditions for emergent language to happen, I mentioned before, we need a focus on meaning, meaningful interaction. And then as a result, emergent language becomes a natural part of the fabric of the interaction of the lesson. So why is emergent language important? Well, I could go on for hours and hours and hours about this, but one simple reason might be the fact that when learners become aware that there's a gap in their knowledge, they're sensitized to any input that they receive in order to help them in that moment. Emergent language goes beyond error. It's not just about making mistakes. As we saw with the vignette at the beginning, there's a lexical gap that the student had. So here we have a communicative breakdown, but it could equally be an error that the learner makes that we might pick up on as emergent language as well. So it's often the repair that we're doing is the kind of reformulation that we provide the learners with in order to help them say what they want to say. It could also be extensions. So providing the learners with alternative ways of saying the same thing. So if you've got, sort of intermediate learners that are kind of, have fallen onto a plateau where they're not really progressing much, we might listen to what they're saying and provide them with other ways of encoding the same meaning in order to push them on developmentally. That can be emergent language as well, that kind of exploration of other possibilities of language as well. It could be as well language that just comes up in the lesson that the learners or the teacher judge to be new or interesting in some kind of way. There was an interesting example. I was watching another pre-int class the other day on CELTA last week or the week before last, and the student came up with the word scammer. The other students didn't know what this meant. So suddenly there was a moment where the teacher was forced, the novice teacher was forced to deal with this in order to help the student clarify what it was, so that the students were clear on what this particular item of language meant. So things pop up a lot in lessons as well that are unplanned. And it's how do we deal with those things? They're not necessarily an add-on at all. In fact, they're probably quite meaningful to the learners if they pop up in that moment and they're important to them there and then. And finally, the most obvious one is when students ask you a question about an aspect of language. And some research that was conducted a couple of years ago noted that when students ask a question, and not surprisingly, when students ask questions, there's greater learner uptake of the language that comes up, because obviously they're interested, they want to know, they've asked you the question. So this is emergent language and this is what it constitutes, but there are some key questions and issues that are involved in this as well. So have a look at the questions. Again, as Mary wasn't reading them out, I'm not going to read the questions out, but I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read these questions. And I'd like you to think as you read the questions, have you experienced any of these? Because I'm sure I can tick the majority of these for myself. Okay. And if you could switch your microphones on and off to let me know when you've read those questions. Okay. I'm going by the 3 I can see at the moment. Okay, so these are some questions that we might have about working with emergent language. And in our book, we address all of these issues that teachers often have when confronted with working with emergent language, or the difficulties that they might have with it. In this short session, we don't have time to look at all of these questions, but we will be looking at a couple of ideas related to some of these. And the first idea that we're going to take a look at is related to finding it hard to hear what the learners are trying to say. So I'd like to start with a story of a recent teacher I was working with on a CELTA course back in December. And Rodrigo is a teacher from Colombia who wanted to extend his practice by doing the CELTA course. So he's a trained teacher, and he was very confident working with target language because that's what his training had focused on, which a lot of training does focus on. Very little of it focused on emergent language. On Delta, obviously, there's often a push towards working with emergent language, and the criteria on the Delta encodes that as well. But it was quite new to him working with emergent language. And it was one interesting thing happened. He was setting up a speaking activity, and then he started monitoring the speaking activity. And very, very suddenly, he looked very concerned and came running over to my desk. And any ideas what you think he might have said? I can't hear any mistakes or gaps. And that's the problem. We had talked about, how to help learners in responding, but maybe what I hadn't done in this particular course was to spend long enough thinking about what you do before you start looking at mistakes and gaps. So the problem is, and I think we've all been there when we've been doing feedback to lessons, is that we can be very easy to grasp at language and not really listen to what the learners are actually talking about. So you have to tune into the content before you can start considering what reformulations you give to the learners. Obviously, the more and more experience we get at this, we're able to multitask and to be able to do things at once. But certainly, if it's new to you working with emergent language in this way, then you've got to start at the beginning by tuning into what the learners are saying. And so practicing listening skills is key. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I've been teaching for nearly 20 years, and I've been a teacher trainer for quite a long time as well. And I went in to teach a pre-intermediate class a few weeks ago, and I've been working at home, mainly doing marking and whatever else. And I had quite a rowdy group of about 15 intermediate learners, and I find it really difficult to tune into them because I hadn't been used to it. It's not like the quiet little breakout rooms that you can really tune into on Zoom, is what I've been used to over the last 2 years a lot as well. So I think I had to give myself the advice that I'm going to share with you next. So our advice would be, first of all, stop listening for the errors to start with. Spend time tuning into individual groups. You can't get around everybody in one go. And note down what they're talking about rather than noting down errors or gaps or anything else at this point. Put these points on the board to support feedback on content after discussion parts of the lesson. So Danny and I thought we're talking about this after this incident, and it's something we had considered before. And we thought about how we could create a task. And in our book, there are a series of different tasks that focus on language, on teacher development. And one of them is this task here, which is tuning in. So I'll let you read the instructions rather than me reading them. Okay, and finally, avoid focusing on language at this stage. And I'd like you to take a picture of this slide or a screenshot of this slide as we're going to have a go at doing this task before we move on to the other bits that we're looking at today. Everybody got that? Okay, so we're going to listen to an extract from a lesson. So some of it's a little bit quiet, so you might want to turn your volume up as loud as you possibly can. We're going to listen to 4 students discussing punishment for young offenders. Okay, they're an upper intermediate class. What I want you to do is to listen to the recording. It's quite a long recording. We'll probably play at least 4 minutes of it. I'll check the time. It's 5 minutes in total. We'll play at least 4 minutes of it. And you need that long to actually really tune into what they're saying, to be able to make a note of the different topics that they're talking about. So your task is, think about what topics you would use in feedback with the learners.
Maybe, I think because this boy is age 14, so police
Can everybody hear that?
put him is not in jail, something to learn more.
Sorry.
And put him to work for something for social or like this.
Yes, in my country has something like this, a social attendance that prevent that it continues doing this and doing because mixture with the others it can improve it's his how can I say criminal intentions like this as you are.
Yeah, because he's still young, so maybe it can learn something good for him.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, and jail is not useful for this age.
No, jail is not the
How is our country?
the good solution.
Yeah.
In my country, we have kind of this this school that we reform him. But it doesn't work in my country. I don't know in the others country as yours.
In our country, there is a kind of prison for kids. Its conditions a bit nice, better than the prison. And the children under 18 years old, if they have if they are arrested,
they go
to this kind of prison.
Yeah.
It's not a real prison. It's a kind of
Not really
to
prison.
reform that
Yeah.
kind of people.
It is
A reformer,
yeah.
isn't it?
Former is
reformer.
yeah.
Yes. In my country, we have this kind of rule. In fact, it doesn't work in my country.
Why? Why you think? Why they doesn't work?
Because people who manage this kind of social attention are not, I think, prepared to do this, or hasn't good intentions. In my country, it's a very controversial situation that you can explain. If I was explaining here, it will take long time, but it doesn't work. The only thing that I could say that is they are so unprepared doesn't care about this kind of situation. In my country, it's very difficult to explain this. I'm hearing really, it's really difficult.
What would happen in Thailand, May?
In Thailand, it's like Turkey. I think they have it's not a real prison, the real jail for the kids who under 18. And if, in my opinion, I think if they do something wrong, okay, they have to punishment, but it's not like adult, because they're just 14, and he's like, I think the family is so important to shape his behavior, everything, and this is his parents wrong, because he just 14, and his mindset is up to his parent, his environment. His parents socialize the kids like that, and he grown up to be like his parents. So he just a kid. We can
Pause it there. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Can you just type in some of the topics that you would possibly use for to conduct feedback on the content of what these students are saying? So if you can pop that in the chat box, we'll take a look at some of your ideas. Pretty good, aren't they? You know, they're getting the meaning across. So when we've got learners at this level, where do we go to next? Yeah, severity of punishment. Anything else? Mm-hmm. 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 So there's a number of different things that we could look at here, and these are all really valid. And you know what I might do, this isn't a real board, I've mocked this one up, is while the students are busy, I'll be making my notes about this, or putting up the ideas of content on the board, maybe making a note of which student has said what, and then in the feedback, asking the learners to return to this, and then we could talk about what they've been speaking about. For example, I might want to look at the kind of way that they've been sharing their different ways to share their contributions. So you could invite them to share using the following prompts. For example, Hen said something really interesting about working instead of jail. Can you tell us more about this? I was really interested in what you said about the parents' POM. Can you tell us more about this, or tell us what you were talking about? Asking follow-up questions to encourage the learners to say more and extend their turns, because this makes the class more communicative. Some of you might be familiar with the study that Scott Thornbury did back in 1996, where he looked at the types of questions that teachers use. And what they looked at is when you use a lot of display questions, so that means questions that are generally the teacher knows the answer to when you're asking learners to display knowledge. Like, for example, what's the past of go? Went. Teacher knows the answer, and you're just asking the learners to display their knowledge. You know, when we're checking understanding, for example, they're very useful to do that. These display questions. However, if we only use display questions and we don't use enough the type of question that we looked at before, I called a genuine question that we looked at in our first vignette, which was, oh, you have a garden. Real question. We call these referential questions, and what Thornbury found, and I think we probably all agree if you've experimented with this, is that if you ask more referential, i.e. real questions to learners, it does make the classroom much more communicative. So moving on from here, following steps 1 to 4, Rodrigo commented that he was better able to notice what the learners were talking about. It made him feel more relaxed. Relaxed is the key word here, that he was listening for a purpose, and he was able to note down some interesting points about what the students were discussing. He conducted some useful feedback on content using referential questions to explore what the learners have been talking about. And he didn't pick up on any emergent language at this moment, but this didn't matter, as tuning into the learner's message is the first step in being comfortable with dealing with the form of language. And as he felt more relaxed and more natural, he found it easier to pick up on emergent language and work with it in later sessions. He's actually working at the centre I work at now at the moment and experimenting with this further. So what we've got to think about with emergent language, the key thing is, and I've got an image of a coral reef here because there's a delicate balance in order for things to grow, is a focus on meaning at first, the teacher being comfortable and the student being comfortable, because we talk about making our students comfortable a lot, but we've got to make ourselves feel comfortable as well. Everybody's got to be feeling comfortable in order for us to work with emergent language. And this creates that kind of space to work with emergent language. This can happen in different parts of the lesson. Obviously, the lead-in, as we looked at with the little vignette with the window box at the beginning. So obviously a rich source when we talk to the students about their lives and what they've been doing. And as Marie-Therese quite rightly said in the class with refugees, that you need to be careful of the topics that you talk about, but certainly real topics. The task that you're giving the learners and the feedback that comes out of that. It could be the response to the text when you've read the text, rather than just going through the comprehension questions. How do we deal with what are the students' ideas about what they think the text is about? This is a rich source for emergent language as well. And feedback on content and meaning in a lesson as well. These are different areas where emergent language at rich moments can happen. So moving on from there, something that I've been doing, I did with a group of part-time course I'm working on at the moment. It's a very small course. I think one of them are here this evening, Zilang, I think. Emma, you're here. And halfway through the course, we did the task that you just did. And then we took it a step further. We thought we'd look at actually what language would you reformulate? And a task that I've used quite a lot on teacher training courses is this following one. It's very, very simple, but it's been found to be quite effective by quite a few people that I've worked with. The task is this. You have two columns. On the left column, you note down verbatim what the learner said. That could be errors, it could be gaps, or you could write down in this column something you didn't understand. Yeah, so you make a note of that and who said what. In the right-hand column, while the students are still busy, you've got time to think about, you can use it, for while you're monitoring, You've got time to think about what you want to reformulate in terms of the learner language. And then you can ask yourself the very simple question, what would I say? And I think that's quite empowering to the teacher. Okay, what's the learner trying to say? Okay, how would I say it? And then writing down your reformulations. And then you've got your feedback ready at the end of a monitoring stage in a lesson. When I experimented with this with my Delta students that I did my MA dissertation research on, they found that this task was really useful in helping train them in the strategy of listening to what the learners are saying and then providing them with feedback. So you can also do this to train yourself, recording the learners, tuning in as we just did, but then the next thing you can do is listen again and sensitize yourself to learner language. That's what we would do if we had more time today. We'd listen again to the recording that we had, and we'd note down in the left-hand column what the learners had said, and we consider some reformulations. We haven't got time for that this evening, so what I will share with you is what my my recent CELTA candidates came up with when we did this stage of the lesson. So this is what they wrote down on the left-hand side column. It's a very tidy board, as you can see. Board work might be the the next action point rather than emergent language. So they've written things like, does care about this kind of situation? The school with reformer, there's a problem there maybe. We've got some others down here. Now, remember, these are 2 experienced teachers from China, and the other people in the group were novice teachers. So they were able to pick up on some things, and then they thought about what kind of reformulation they might give them. And we're going to take a closer look at this. But what I wanted to do is to go a bit further. And another thing that Danny and I have been looking at is, rather than just picking up on the language after you've tuned in, and then thinking about how you'd reformulate it, it's thinking about the reason why you'd choose that language. What's the principle that's guiding you to choose that, to make that choice about the language that you're going to work on? And I think even as experienced teachers, Danny and I did it, and it's quite interesting to look at what our choices are of the things that we do quite automatically very often. So the third idea that I'd like to share with you is to address the issue of what aspects of language or interaction should I focus on. Now, when we say emergent language, I should have said at the beginning, it does stretch beyond just the words, the lexis, the phonology and the grammar, and it actually goes beyond that to interaction. So it could be, how smooth was the interaction between a group? Where were the breakdowns in that? What help did they need in order to make interaction better? So that also comes into emergent language as well. So some principles we might want to consider, what aspects of choice, what would inform our choice. First of all, it could be this one. I'll let you read this one. And obviously, prioritizing gaps is a big one, as we saw at the beginning. It's often when there's a gap that the learners are ready for some help and support. They're not always aware that they're miscommunicating. Often they are. So that's key. What's relevant to your teaching context and your learners' needs? Maybe repeated issues with similar forms. Choosing language, as we looked at the beginning, that's interesting or useful to work on. Focusing on high frequency language. The term I used at the beginning was language that has high surrender value, language that the learners are going to meet again and again and can use again and again. And recycling things that previously taught. Or do you remember the other day we talked about that? What was the word for that? So letting the emergent language resurge, if you like, in the lesson by reminding them of what's happened previously. It could be looking at, if you're very familiar with the learners L1, it might be working with issues with L1 interference as well. Or it could be providing the learners with specific feedback on specific language for a task that you've done with them as well. So we've got this is definitely not an exhaustive list, and there's overlap between some of these, as we'll see in a moment. So I got the trainees in my CELTA group to think about this, and it prompted quite an interesting discussion about the choice that we have for different bits of language. Now, the emergent language was new to these people, even maybe the more experienced teachers from the context they're working in. So these are not all the choices that we might make, or more experienced teachers might make, but I think it's a good place to start. And it shows that even novice teachers can come up with some useful contributions in terms of emergent language. And what emerged was basically these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different principles that you looked at. The other ones weren't there. Obviously, we weren't recycling anything when we listened to this recording. And we're going to take each one and look at them very briefly. So if we look at the slide over here, we've got the right-hand column. We notice that lexical gap pops up a couple of times, wider range of vocabulary, lexical gap. But the first one is to do with a miscommunication. Does care about this kind of situation? If you remember, this is what Louise, who had a lot to say, one of the things that he said. So when we talked about it, they said, well, we focus on this because it's unclear. And I think that's quite a valid reason. The next one I'm not so sure about. I don't know how you felt about it, but they were all skating around because they didn't know the term for youth detention centre, or whatever term we'd like to use. So it might be useful to feed this in afterwards. But I mean, to be honest, the learners did quite a good job of circumlocuting that, and they all understood what they were talking about. They picked up on this issue with reform, because I think he used reform correctly to start with, and then he wasn't sure. So perhaps there's an issue with the form of the word that we might need to focus on here. So a gap in the learner's knowledge or security with using a particular form, because it's often that pops up, isn't it, in lessons? It's the learners trying something and they might be almost right, but they're not sure. And it's that feedback from the teacher that can give them that kind of sense of comfort and clarity in those moments. It could be focusing on a repeated issue. This is one that I don't think I would have picked up on myself, but they thought that there might be an issue between learn and teach me something, learn me something and teach me something. So, okay, fair enough. That might be a valid reason to focus on something there. It could be choosing language that's useful. Again, this is one that I don't think I'd have pulled out, but one of the participants did pull it out to work on, because I think the students actually understood it doesn't work. But actually, you could use it as a springboard to explore alternatives. It's not effective. It doesn't have the desired effect. They're an upper intermediate class after all. So maybe taking something that they've said that's correct and use it as a springboard to look at a range of different ways to encode the same meaning is also possible as well. And finally, I mean, this one I think is debatable. My country is a controversial situation. I mean, this could be L1 interference, or what the course participants, my trainees, were saying is that they thought that it's quite a common structure to say the situation in X is adjective, and that it would provide you with an opportunity to explore a range of different adjectives as well. So remember, these are CELTA course participants. 2 of them are currently studying an MA at King's as well. So, you know, I think it's quite interesting that they were able to, it was interesting seeing what their choices were after they tuned in, what their choices were, and then looking at what they would reformulate it to, and then having a discussion about why, getting them first to think about why, and then having a discussion about why. So this is something you can do by yourself, obviously, or it's something that you can do with a colleague, have a discussion with a colleague, or with a line manager, or if you're a teacher trainer, when you're working with course participants on either CELTA or Delta, or wherever other Cert TESOL or DIP TESOL courses. So what can you do next? I'm aware I'm quite short on time, and I want to save a few minutes for questions. So what can you do next? Well, you know, sort of following very much in the tradition of investigating classroom practice of Steve Mann and Steve Walsh, you know, we very much firmly believe that you know, teacher reflection and teacher development should be very much evidence-based. So things like, you know, making recordings of your learners. You know, record yourself doing feedback on content with the learners in class. Just quickly record a little segment of your lesson, or record the students when they're in interaction. Note down what's happening in there. Notice what's happening. What are you doing? Because often we do things subconsciously without even realizing, and often our attention, hopefully our attention, is on the learners and not on ourselves or what we're doing next. But it's quite nice to stand back and have a look at what we actually do. If you use video, which I'd really advocate doing, it's slightly daunting the first time you do it, when you have to get over, is that how I sound? Oh no, look, that shirt, I'll never wear that again. When you get over that, you can actually get beyond that and look at what's really happening in the interaction. And that can be quite revealing. And Michael Wallace talks about the different kinds of things that you can discover. You know, some things can be illuminative, where you learn something more about what you do in the classroom. So for example, you know, for me, I didn't realize that I gave such explicit feedback. This is on Danny and Nick Andon's research. I wasn't aware I gave such explicit feedback or reformulations to learners, rather than giving recasts. And obviously my belief was I wanted to highlight it more, but I had to explore that. And by watching myself, I was able to do that. Or it can be what Wallace calls heuristic. We find out something new about our practice that we didn't know at all. And that might, you know, set off a chain of events for more investigation into what we do in class. So this is what we would advocate with emergent language. So first of all, focusing on content, but the other thing you could do is very simple. You could take photos of your board. I do this all the time. I did this today when I was teaching this morning a class, and I then can go back and have a look at what I put up there. What were my choices behind the language? Which ones am I going to bring back into class tomorrow? Because remember, a criticism of emergent languages, it goes up there and there might be uptake from learners where they note it down in their books, or they nod, or they say it back to you, or they use it back to you, you know, a little bit later. But we should maybe think about how we recycle that language. And in the book, we've got lots of ideas for that as well. Finally, if you're feeling very keen and you've got time on your hands, I know we're busy people, teachers, but you could start a teaching journal. And people in the past, I'm thinking Dale Coulter, who worked at IH many years ago now, when he was straight off a cell, to use a teaching journal to look at how he was working with emergent language. And you can track your progress, but in here, identifying the reasons why you've selected particular language to work on. So in this very short session, so it's a little bit rushed this evening, but we've looked at how it's important to focus on genuine, meaningful interaction and pick up on the content first before diving in with language, because I think we often feel that we've got to grasp at something to give them some language, actually hold back and focus on the meaning first. We've looked at reformulation and extension, and examine some underlying beliefs about what kind of language you pick up on and why. And we've had a couple of ideas for exploring your practice. Our book comes out this autumn. We've been working very hard on it, and we're very, very excited about it. And we're very grateful to Pavilion for giving us an opportunity to write it, and our wonderful editor, Penny Hands, who's diligently editing the last bit of it, and it should be out in September. If you would like to pre-order a copy, here is the website. You can take a screenshot of this one, the Pavilion website. If you Google Working with Emergent Language, you can pre-order a copy. If not, we're hoping it's ready in the early autumn. If you would like to go back and have a look at some of the slides of the things that we've talked about today, on Danny Norrington Davis's WordPress, there are 2 talks that have got a variety of some of the things we've spoken about this evening. If you would like to drop me an email, my email's here. It'd be great to hear about what you're doing with emergent language. I work at International House London and King's College London as well. So I'll stop going on now, and I'll throw it open to you. Do you have any questions or comments?
Richard, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I ask a question about what you said to Rodrigo earlier on in the course? Can you hear my mic?
Yeah.
I want to check if I understand it right. Rodrigo listened into the pairs, and you advised him to listen to the content, the topic of what was going on.
Yeah.
You then advised him to ask the students to extend their ideas after they'd finished the pair work all class.
Sorry, just let me break that one down. So if it wasn't clear, in that lesson, and for a few lessons, I said, don't worry about picking up on language, just listen to them, because that was his issue. He was in the context of being in London and not, hearing accents he wasn't familiar with, teaching adults which he wasn't familiar with. So for him, the tuning in was really important for this particular case. Does that make sense, Nick?
I mean, my question was, if you then ask the students to develop their ideas in a feedback stage, in a sense, as a teacher, you have two chances at hearing their language. You've had a go in pair work, and you've now had a go in the feedback stage, which enables you to tune in better to hear and make those, gives you more time to choose what to reform. Is that a valid point?
I think it's a really valid point. Yeah, it's all about that point I made about confidence, and it's so you feel confident that you can work with it, because your brain's going so fast. And Mulderers and Waddell, I think, have this brilliant description of teaching as a complex open skill. It's complex because we're multitasking all of the time with so many different things. So often, this is why emergent language is left out, because it's difficult, because you're doing so many different things to actually work with. Concentrate on what the learners are saying, hang on, reformulate that, hang on, classroom management, all of these things. So I think, and it's an open skill because there's not one right way to respond to it. So I think certainly anything that can help you feel more calm and relaxed and take the pressure off your working memory allows for future for more to work with emergent language more in the future. Does that make sense, Nick?
Thanks, that's great.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay. All right, well.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, Richard, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much, and I'll hand you back to James for the information about Delta.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard. That was great, and we do look forward to your book in the fall, hopefully. Fingers crossed. So I'll keep an eye out for that one myself, actually. So.